Welcome to Camp Code, a podcast brought to you by Camp Hacker. We have created and are dedicated to this podcast because we believe that staff training is one of, if not the most important part of your job as a camp director. Staff training is what prepares your staff to care for their kids, to feel confident in their skills, to do their jobs to the best of their ability, and to learn along the way. A well thought out and intentional staff training will help you in more ways than you can imagine. And we need to help each other bring our very best. So we're going to start today by introducing ourselves. So Ruby, we'll let you go first.
My name is Ruby Compton. I am the Chief Exploration Officer for Ruby Outdoors, and I run a consulting and training company in Western North Carolina, and I do support for camps all over the world for whatever they need. I'm like a freelance camp director, really, is what I am these days.
Love it. Sounds like a very fun job.
It is.
Gab, not so much freelance. How about you introduce yourself?
I was going to say, I wish Ruby lived closer, because if I knew I could just hire her in those moments, I would. Well, my name is Gabrielle. I'm one of the camp directors of Camp Waro, and Camp Waro is an all-girls camp in the Laurentian Mountains, and we focus on creating a positive female community, and we do that while we speak in French and in English.
So you think it's hard in just one language? Try two.
Yeah, it's so amazing.
Thanks, Gab. And I'm Beth Allison. I'm co-owner of Camp Hacker and Go Camp Pro. And I was an executive director of 5 children's summer camps for 15 years in Muskoka, Ontario, Canada. And am now a consultant with a passion for intentional leadership training. So our topic today is building self-esteem in our staff. And Ruby's going to share with us why we picked this very easy, short, tiny little topic.
Yeah, well, I'm going to make the statement that all behavior is a result of self-esteem. All behavior is a result of self-esteem. And so we have a lot of behaviors we manage at camp. So let's talk about self-esteem today.
Perfect. Succinct. The most basic human desire is to feel like we belong, and fitting in is really important. We all need to connect with each other, and in order to connect, we first have to value who we are. And I think in the last number of years especially, we've all seen the cost of low self-esteem in our staff. They often fail to recognize what they do achieve and feel good about it. It can make them feel excluded and disconnected. It can make them often want to surrender their individuality and conform to stereotypes that are often not positive ones. And it can make them feel like they can't handle life's challenges. Sometimes they feel like an absolute miserable failure. And of course, we have to be careful, because this can also lead to things like depression and destructive behavior and self-harm and eating disorders and alcohol and drug abuse, all those kinds of things. So we all know that healthy self-esteem is like a person's armor against the challenges of our world. And there are many these days. So people with self-esteem can find those kind of challenges to be sources of major anxiety and frustration, and they have a really hard time finding solutions to problems. So for us, we want to talk about ways that if we can build our self-esteem in our staff, if we can help them work on that, if we can help them sort of realize their potential and create some sort of a toolkit to deal with everything that they have battling their self-esteem, then we can help them become their very best selves. So today we're going to give you some ideas and ways that you can do that. So let's dive in. Ruby, we'll start with you. What do you got?
I'm going to say 2 things that I say every podcast, I feel like. So one is, in talking about esteem, I think self-esteem, we can talk about it in the context of the kids, right? So if we don't have to necessarily dive right in and say, how's your self-esteem to our staff? That may be a little much on your first few days of staff training. But I think very early on in your training, you could talk about how do we build self-esteem in kids? And what does high self-esteem at camp look like? What does low self-esteem look like? What behaviors might result? And what's confusing is, like, there are going to be some behaviors that overlap. And so being able to discern and see patterns and use context to help you with that, those are all things that we need to talk about. And when we use the context of kids, as I say at every single podcast, it feels like, that then it allows the staff to engage with talking about their own experiences at their level of how much they want to choose to opt into that conversation. So they can share about experiences based on what they've seen from kids, or kids that they've worked with, or nieces, nephews, kids they've babysat, Or they can say, when I was a kid, I felt this way, or I still feel this way. So it allows that opportunity for that conversation without forcing it, which I think is really great. And the other thing that I'll say that I think we say on every podcast is I think you need to start with yourself, and really pay attention to where your esteem is, and understand that I think we often categorize self-esteem as like high and low, and then that's it. And it's a spectrum for sure. And it's a spectrum in all different areas of your life. So where your esteem sits as a leader may be really different how it sits as a partner, or as a friend, or in your home, or at your workplace. It really varies. And so understanding that, looking for triggers that you have when you feel frustrated or upset, don't just be angry, like have that moment of awareness and going, oh, how could this be related to where my esteem is around this? So me personally, I know that when I brought a decision to my staff, whether it was something they were involved in or not, and somebody would push back on me and be like, well, why is this decision? Why didn't you do this? Like, I didn't want to be with this person. I wanted to be with this person. Like, that was something that my cheeks would start to get red. And I was like, oh, just accept it. Like, I thought about it, you know? But that in the end, that actually is an esteem issue that I have about, you know, my authority and my decision-making and some stuff around that. So I think paying attention, just by bringing that awareness, that is a step in the right direction towards being able to function better, work on stuff, and continue to grow and be the leader that you need to be.
Great. Thank you. How about you, Gab? What have you got to start us off?
I was just reflecting on what Ruby was saying, and I think that I think we need to call it like the camper inception technique. So, you know, because we talk about this so often that sometimes when subjects are too close to home for our staff members and we're trying to have them understand it, it's so much easier for that to talk about certain topics when we're chatting about it in the context of campers. So the camper inception technique, I think maybe, or we can come up with an acronym, but
the CIT, yeah,
the
there it is.
CIT. So many layers, yeah. But it is true, because it's a sensitive issue, and self-esteem. I remember hearing a parent saying, you know, well, I don't want my kid to have too much self-esteem, and I remember thinking, that's actually not how self-esteem works. And I understand that we don't want necessarily people to be cocky, and we want people to be aware that the space that they're taking up, but that's actually a lack of self-esteem as well. If you're on stage a lot, or you end up speaking a lot and taking up a lot of space, you're anxious that you're not being heard. You're anxious that what's being said isn't making an impact on other people. So our goal as camp directors is to create the most self-esteem within our staff members, and not to be afraid that that's going to create a bunch of staff members that are full of themselves. Actually, it will create staff members that are empathetic, because they have space within themselves without negative noise to be empathetic towards themselves, and then of course towards others. And that's what the goal is. Self-esteem, when we're in the area of low self-esteem, there's a lot of aggression that's going on in our staff members. There's a lot of negative thoughts, negative words, and unfortunately, those thoughts, that voice is usually a lot more powerful than our voice as camp directors. So as Ruby was saying, the camper inception technique, I really like doing that. So one of the things that I teach our staff is the SAS technique. So to SAS our campers, which is, if there's a behavioral issue and you want a camper to stop what they're doing, the first thing that you do as a staff member is to stop what you're doing, approach appropriately. So if it's an emergency, run towards them. If it's not an emergency, then calmly walk towards them, and then speak kindly. And how this has to do, what this connects to in self-esteem, is the speak kindly part. If we're teaching our staff in all situations, in any situation, to the end result is that you're speaking with kindness, then what we're telling our staff members is everybody deserves kindness. Everybody deserves to be spoken that way. And we can also make that link to their internal monologue. So that's one of the camper inception techniques that I like to use. The other one that I like to use is VIP, which is validating, investigating, and problem solving. A lot of the times we tell campers, staff members, not us particularly, but they hear the words, it's, it's not that bad, you'll be okay, don't worry about it. And what we want is we want to not dismiss people's feelings, we want to validate their feelings. And by validating their feelings, we're helping staff members within their internal monologue to say, it's okay that I'm feeling this way, let's investigate why I'm feeling this way. So with campers, we teach staff members to validate the experience and then investigate. So why are you afraid of the water? Was there something that had happened in the past? Is it that you've never swam in a lake before, maybe in a pool or an ocean? And then problem solve together. Let's come up with a solution. Let's try to find a way that you can participate that feels comfortable for you. So in the camper inception technique, I like teaching that to staff members. So then when I am talking to staff members throughout the summer about their own performance, obviously I'm using the similar technique, but it is within our camp value system to validate the experience of our campers. Therefore, it's important that we validate the experience of our staff.
Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. You folks out there better have lots of pen and paper today. For me, there are 4 steps to building self-esteem in people, in our staff. And we're going to go through a couple now and maybe 2 more later. But for me, the first is to engage them. And that's a lot harder than we think. For me, in order to move mountains of any kind, so to enhance that positive change for our staff members and obviously for our campers, trickle down, of course, but we need to create the right kind of environment for them to grow. So we need to establish a safe place where they can be encouraged to take risks, to fail, try again, figure out who they really are, and dream about the possibilities of what they will become and how they will leave their mark at camp and on the planet. And what we need is a place where staff feel loved, valued, and affirmed for who they are, and who grow into young adults that will not only aspire to be their very best selves, but will also be empowered to help other people do the same. So each other, and of course their campers. So we need to give them that sense of belonging. So I'm going to share a tool with you now that you can use to help create this feeling of safety. And if you've ever heard our podcast, it's one you've heard me share before, but it's really worth repeating when we're talking about healthy self-esteem. So we need to create those boundaries, ones that are easily understood and embraced by everybody. So years ago, my husband Travis and I created the 4 S's at our camp, and they are safety, stewardship, servanthood, and self-esteem. And for us, these 4 questions helped us quantify our circle of safety at camp. So there are 4 questions that they need to ask themselves before doing any activity or any song or any discussions with each other, whatever it happens to be. So safety, is it physically, emotionally, socially, spiritually, all those kinds of things, safe? Stewardship, are you being a good steward of the earth and all its resources? Servanthood, are you serving other people and the community with your actions and your words? And of course, self-esteem, are you building someone's self-esteem? So if people couldn't answer yes to all 4 questions, then they couldn't do that activity or sing that song or do that dance or run that program. So think about what your boundaries are at camp. Borrow ours if you like, or some other camps who has great ones that have resonated with you, or create your own, but use them every single day, no exceptions. When you create this kind of environment, you make people feel safe, which is an incredibly important part in fostering really healthy self-esteem. So I'm going to share with you just a super quick activity that you can do during training to help people feel safe. So get your staff together, hand out Post-it notes, get everybody to take, 4 or 5, maybe more, whatever you like, and ask your staff to think of a place where they feel like they belong, and ask them to write that down on one Post-it note and keep it separated. So they write down whatever it is. You'll find that a lot of your staff will write down camp, which is good. That means you're doing good things. But it could be school, it could be home, it could be church, it could be someplace in a community center or sorority or a sports team, whatever it happens to be. Now ask them, take all of those Post-it notes, post them on one wall of your space, and then ask them next to think of why that place gives you a sense of belonging and to put that on another Post-it note. and ask them to write down as many reasons as they can come up with, but one reason per Post-it note. So you're going to have lots of those. And what I would then do is go over things together. So I would read aloud all the answers, because now I'm taking all of the second set of Post-it notes and putting them on the other opposite wall. Of course, there'll be a lot more of those than the first ones. Read those together, categorize them, because a lot of them will be overlapping or very similar, and come up with a list. So your list could look something like, it could say things like, it's a place where I feel welcomed or cared for or respected. It's where I feel like I have some power, or I can influence positive change, or it's where I know I will be heard, or it's safe to give my opinions. All those kinds of things will come up. And then you decide together that this is how you want everyone to feel when you are together, and that you will all work to ensure that all of you will feel this way. And now what I would do for the last step is to ask each staff member to write down what they have to offer to your group to ensure that all people will feel this way. And you can then have them share that out loud, whether it's in partners or small groups or as a whole large staff. But each person can share, what do I have to offer to camp as a role model? How can I help my camp family out this summer? And then together write your own creed, what you promise to give your fellow staff people at camp. So that's step one, is making sure that you engage them in these kinds of activities and these kinds of conversations, but to do it very carefully and of course with great intention. Step number two is to validate them. So this is a little bit different than Gabs. She was talking about validating feelings, incredibly important, of course. But this particular step is to validate them exactly as they are. So showing young people that they are loved and accepted simply because they exist is the first and most important step in building healthy self-esteem. Self-worth isn't complicated. You're worthy because you exist, that's it. It doesn't increase or decrease based on the number of friends that you have or some grade you earned or who wants to date you. You are worthy. So creating this kind of environment, especially during those years when they're really trying to figure out who they are, will lay the foundation for you to do some really great work with them that helps them on this journey of self-discovery. So another quick training activity before we move back to Ruby is to ask them how many of them have seen the movie It's a Wonderful Life. And for a lot of them, it's something they will watch every single Christmas. Not exactly my favorite Christmas film. I think it's a little dark. However, the premise in it is great for this particular activity. So there is a young man, Jimmy Stewart, who really feels like he's let everybody down. His life is falling apart, and he kind of wants to end things, and an angel comes and shows him an alternate reality. So his friends, his town, his family, as they would be if he had never lived. And I think that sometimes it's easy to forget all the positive ways that we touch the lives of other people. So we need to say to our staff that your life matters. Your friends, your family, your acquaintances, your colleagues are all affected by you in big and little ways, and that you have a place in the world that nobody else can fill the same way that you do. So here's the quick exercise. Ask them to write down the names of people that they know, and they need to write down at least 10. And then next to each name, have them list one or more ways that they have given that person something positive. So it doesn't matter if it's big or small, if it's yesterday or 10 years ago. It doesn't even matter if the other person doesn't acknowledge it or remember it. So while they're making this list and writing these things down, play some nice music. Natalie Merchant's Kind and Generous is a lovely little song to play in there, but give them some time to do that, and then ask them to share with a partner 3 things that they did for someone. So they don't have to share the whole list, but 3 things they're comfortable sharing. And then have your partner celebrate your wonderful life. So the partner can reply with a statement of affirmation, and you can decide what that would be, or it might be something that they decide on their own. So they could say things like, you are unique and perfect just the way you are. Or the world is a better place because you're in it, whatever it is you'd like to say. And you can front load with them that they may feel a little bit silly when they do this, or it might feel a little bit uncomfortable when they share something nice that they did for someone, and that's okay, that we're not used to receiving compliments like this. And we need to become more comfortable with it and acknowledge it and thank it because we are worth it and we are worthy. So those are 2 of the 4 steps. So we're going to head back to Ruby and see what else she's got going on today.
Yeah, I want to share this tidbit, which is your self-esteem is your work to do. That nobody can do that work for you. You can create the space, you can nudge, you can hold the boundaries, but in the end, you can't just look at somebody and say, have higher self-esteem. Like, it doesn't work that way. And you can't just be like, and here's some self-esteem for you. Like they even if you say that, they have to do the accepting of it, kind of like you were talking about, that taking on that gift and understanding it themselves. And so a great resource for this is our Women in Camp Summit closing keynote. Shannon Weber wrote a book called Show Up Hard. And one of the big things that I took away from that book was the idea that you can be working with people and very empathetic, but when we get too empathetic into their journeys and lives, that we get really tangled up in it, and then our self-worth becomes tied up in their work, which we have zero control over. And so we have to know where to draw those boundaries, and know that that their self-esteem is their work to do and your self-esteem is your work to do. You can be doing it side by side, and you can be doing it in the same space. And I think what we do at camp is we hold a space where that work can be done, but in the end, they have to do the work. they have to show up and do it. So I like to empower my facilitators and my leaders to use the terminology and language, whether they say this out loud or it's just in their head, but looking at behaviors and interactions that participants are having, or maybe even interactions they're having with other staff, and saying, I wonder what's going on here. So reprogramming I can't believe they just did that. And instead saying, I wonder what's going on here. I wonder why this camper is choosing to blatantly break the rules. I wonder what's going on here, right? Because that allows us to put the scientist lens on and to investigate a little further. And again, cools the emotions, calms us down a little bit, makes us foster our curiosity and play to the curious nature of ourselves versus just the emotional sides of ourselves. So I think that can be a really helpful statement for your staff to know, is that I wonder what's going on here, and let that guide them. And the other thing that I can't remember which one of you said it, but just this idea of the internal monologue, I think bringing some awareness to the language that we use when we're talking to ourselves. This is something that I've been working on really deliberately over the last few years. Something really simple, like if I come back from a run and I'm super sweaty, that I'll be like, oh, I'm so gross right now. No, I'm not gross. Like I'm just sweaty. And like, yeah, people probably don't want a hug from me right now, but that doesn't mean I'm a gross human. It just means that I'm sweaty. And so when we can take some of that judgment out of our language, then that's going to change the internal monologue, which will in turn change some of that esteem stuff that's going on if we're not constantly attacking ourselves. And so I think when you hold up the mirror to folks, like, people don't even think about it. And once you are thinking about it, you hear somebody say something and it's jarring. You're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe you just said that about yourself. When somebody's like, I'm so stupid, I can't believe I did this. So think about those internal monologues. I wonder what's going on here, and your self-esteem is your work to do.
I love that. It is your work to do. And I think it is one of those things, and I'm very guilty of it myself. We, as camp people, take such good care of our campers and our staff and our colleagues. And then the things that we either say about ourselves or in our own heads are never things we would say to other people. And so we treat ourselves often so unkindly.
Yeah.
And so making that connection so that you can start to do the change and do the work is a great idea. Gab, what else have you got?
Well, with staff members in that sense of being kind to themselves, also explaining normal behaviors and why we do what we do. So one of the things I like talking about within our the camper inception technique is clumps versus cliques. So just for people to understand what the difference is between the two. Clumps is when you clump together out of safety, out of knowing versus unknowing. Usually it's when there's new people that are coming into your circle, you tend to, or you might know them, but you gravitate to people that you're most comfortable with. And that's clumping. That's Mother Nature. That's protective. That's okay. Cliques is when you're actively excluding somebody else. So just understand that when we're trying to protect ourselves, we tend to clump, and that's not negative, but we have to be aware that that type of clumping behavior might to other people feel exclusive. So just understand why we're doing that, so we're not hard on ourselves, but then also maybe shift our behavior. So just a little bit of education in that piece. The other thing is that it's important, and Ruby had mentioned this at the beginning, to be aware of your own self-esteem issues, but you can also voice your I think it's important for camp directors to voice their vulnerabilities to your staff. So role modeling that you're not perfect. A lot of young camp counselors will look up to you, think that you have it, all together, that you're perfect in what you do. You're amazing, which is lovely. But it's obviously a bar that's not achievable. So to express, how do you work? Where do you make mistakes? How do you get frazzled? So for example, not all of my staff members, but my leadership team members know I get really, really stressed on visitors day and opening day. I love kids, and I love adults, but I love them separately. I do not like the families to be intermingled. I find it extremely stressful. I'm also extremely judgmental, which I am working on. But I'm mostly stressed. I'm mostly stressed because of the energy that parents bring into the camp when they come and pick up their kids or drop off their kids. Is high amount of anxiety, and I know I'm the one that's managing it. So with parents, I'm good, but when before parents arrive, I'm very stressed, and my staff aren't used to seeing me that way, especially new leadership team members. So I let them know beforehand, this is what happens. This is my anxiety. These are why I have them. And it shows them that it's okay to be stressed. So bringing out your own vulnerabilities is an important part of creating that safe environment that Beth was talking about before. And last but not least is inviting staff members to come forward when they are confused, when they have questions, when they have made mistakes. So creating that culture and proving to staff members that this is actually a part of our community is bringing forward things that you're overwhelmed by or that you think isn't right, and voicing your opinion is something that we value within our organization. This isn't done overnight, of course. This is something that we have to do every year. And this is something that we have to remind ourselves that it's a value within our organization. And I think one of the best ways to do that is have your returning staff members talk about, a time when they didn't come forward for 2 to 3 to 4 weeks, and then they did, and how actually wonderful it was when they did. And this is the shift that we've made, and talk about how do we create a healthy risk-taking environment. But it's something that we need to say that is of value within our organization. And one of the things that I hear from our staff members over and over and over again, when they don't come forward, our young staff members, our new staff members, is the number one thing is they say, it wasn't a big deal. And what they're really saying is, I don't matter in those instances. And that's why I think the camper inception technique is so important, to highlight that, that we want to build people's self-esteem. And as Beth said earlier, we would never say these thoughts that we have, these negative thoughts, to outwardly. We also want people to feel great about themselves, but sometimes it's really hard to do that for ourselves. So creating that space, role modeling that within our organization, speaking up is really, really important, because you do matter. But having past staff members share those stories, that will set the stage, and then rewarding them for when they do come forward and telling them how wonderful it is to hear their opinion.
Great, thank you. And just to clarify for any Americans out there who are still confused by what Gab said, in Canada we say cliques, and in America you say cliques. So that's what Gab meant when she was cliques versus clumping. Cliques versus clumping, same sort of thing. So
same thing, different accent.
Right, exactly. It's where we Canadians keep the French part. So my first 2 steps were to engage and validate. So here are steps 3 and 4. Number 3 is educate. So if you've ever heard Jess Wiener, she does some great talks, and she's written a wonderful book, but in her TED Talk, she tells us that we need to help young adults understand that self-esteem is equated with confidence. But the problem is that more and more our young people believe that confidence equals perfection. And we've talked about this in a number of podcasts. What we really need to tell them is that gaining confidence is all about self-discovery, and that self-discovery is hard work, and it won't be easy, and there will be struggles, and it will probably take a lifetime, but it's never perfect. Jess tells us that our real job as youth development professionals is to help our people discover the tools that they need to develop character, which she says is the real currency of life. So for me, what you'll want to do in this education piece is to create real intentional programming that lets your staff talk or journal or draw or create, but practice the kinds of skills that they need. And in this day and age of people being mean to other people on the internet and our staff seeing our world leaders, for example, doing the exact same thing, we need to teach our staff that they can be kind and genuine and supportive people, and that they can develop skills to help them grow into loving, caring adults. So think about creating time during training to talk about these kinds of difficult issues that your staff face every day. If you're a co-ed staff, you may choose to have an evening program or an afternoon program if you're a day camp during training that separates them into the genders that they identify with. Often this can make it easier for relatability to certain issues or give them a bit more comfort in talking about difficult things, but you also may choose to keep them all together, whatever works for you. We used to run a women's circle and a men's circle during staff training, and then we'd run the same thing every week throughout the summer. So I didn't obviously run the men's time, but I'm going to speak to you a bit about what we did in women's circles. So for me, this was time apart with my staff who identified as female, and it was a sacred time to share feelings and thoughts and ask questions and some real intentional learning to allow time for self-reflection and growth. For me, my young women needed a place to feel safe and to share concerns and ask questions, and they needed to hear from the older women on staff, for example, the ones maybe who were finishing up university or college or had already done so, who could help share some of their experiences and their life lessons. And having these kinds of women's circles, it gave them time to feel empowered as female and time to feel responsible for helping each other out. So I started my program thanks to a curriculum for girls' circles that was given to me by Joanne Cates of Camp Erewhon in Ontario. And she had daily activities and discussions and boundaries and guidelines. And then we took it and used it to help us create our own. So our goals for that women's circle was to talk about issues, to strengthen ourselves as women, to bring down barriers, to squash gender stereotypes. If you're going to do this before you begin together as a group, and we used to do this every single year, you come up with your rules and you all agree to them and then sign a covenant together once they're all decided. So these are rules almost every year they would say what happens in women's circle stays in women's circle. There was no male bashing, crying was okay, like whatever is important to your group. And I highly recommend that if you're not a social worker yourself, you have one on speed dial. Before you begin a program like this, because things may come up that need to be dealt with one-on-one or outside of that circle. And as I mentioned, our males on staff did something we called mail call. Very creative, but I obviously didn't run that, and what happened in mail call stays in mail call, but I do know that it was along the same lines. So creating some sort of time where they can have separate time apart or together as a co-ed staff is totally cool. But it's intentional time to talk about some of these kinds of issues and to know that you've created that safe space, safer space and braver space to do that. And finally, step 4 is empower. And so we need to let them experience the power of building each other up. They need to understand those kinds of opportunities. So for example, one way is to help them understand their ability to be their own editors and publishers with the tools of social media. So we need to talk to them about the power that they have to shift the media message that they receive to give their own message, which is something I truly wish I'd had as a teenager. We need to encourage them to empower each other using social media for good. So I made often great use of Pinterest as a camp director, or any place where you can find nice quotes, memes, all that kind of stuff, and I would print them all out and place them all over camp. So they would go in cabins, in session areas, in the bathroom stalls, in the showers. everywhere I could find, and I would change them up weekly. And one of the things I loved was getting up early on Change the Signs Day and then hearing people as they noticed them and agreed with them and started discussions about them. And it really was a great way to sort of engage, validate, educate, and empower. And one last activity for me for training, I did an activity with my staff where I asked each one of them to draw their own self-portrait. And I explained and front-loaded that there were absolutely no extra points for artistic talent, but I encouraged each of them to draw themselves as they saw themselves. And then I asked them to draw or use words or symbols, doodles, whatever they wanted, to portray 3 things that they liked about themselves. And I will tell you, this was incredibly difficult for a lot of my staff. And then I asked them to turn to a partner and draw the partner. And after they had done so, I asked them to portray 3 things that were amazing about this partner. And to end off with, I let them see their partner's drawing. So they never had to share their own, but I let them see their partner's drawing, and I had them spend some time reflecting and journaling about the 2 different pictures that they saw in front of them and how they may need to start seeing themselves in the light that other people see them. So those are my 4 steps: engage, validate, educate, empower. And for me, they have to go in that order. You can't start empowering your staff on day 1 of training if you haven't spent time doing the engaging and the validating. They're also not equal steps. So you need to maybe spend a lot longer on the first 2 before you start on steps 3 and 4. You'll kind of figure it out. And the other thing is that they're not finite. Like, you don't sort of finish the engagement period and then you're done. You don't spend a week or 2 validating them and never going back to that step. It's an ongoing process. So my suggestion would be, for now, to take those 4 steps, start figuring out what activities you can do under each of them, and then work them in during training and throughout the summer to have your staff have the healthiest self-esteem possible. Anybody have any other things they'd like to add before we go to our recap?
I would say you brought it up briefly, Beth, but just to reiterate the power of journaling and bringing that to your staff to do on a daily basis. And we started introducing journaling 3 or 4 years ago, and we did not start on a daily basis because it was a new thing we were doing at camp, but we started building it into our staff training, and now we've brought it into also throughout camp, throughout the summer. And a lot of it has to do with how do you perceive yourself. A lot of it has to do with trying to help them see what they're doing is valid and important. And one of my favorite things to ask, which is constructive, is to simply ask, what did I do well today? How can I replicate that for tomorrow? So it's less based on feelings and it's more based on action, and it's also showing that they can redo something again the next day that's going to be positive. And they do need help with this at first, and it's a little bit confusing because it's like, well, I was great at my table, I'll just be great again. So it's about being specific on what does great mean, what does that look like, and how can you apply that to different parts of camp. So if you did X, Y, and Z at your table, how can you apply that somewhere else? And it's just getting into their mind what techniques they're using, and why is it helpful, et cetera, et cetera. So there's so many journaling questions that you can find online, and my recommendation would be to provide your staff members with a journal book and say that one half of the journal book is just for their own notes, their own thoughts, et cetera, and the other half is for their supervisors, or that they can share with somebody else. So one is for your eyes only, and the other part is for sharing, so then they can get feedback, and then start off slowly and front load that this is something that's important. And it of course practices mindfulness and et cetera, et cetera. There's great science on the benefits of journaling.
That's great. Thanks, Gab. There is a camp that we met in this past year at a conference, and they have added journaling into their camp program. So I think it's at 4:30 every day. Everybody on camp finds a spot of their own and they all journal, like for half an hour. Everybody just spends that time. And they've said it has really change the way their campers and their staff feel about themselves, and also has brought anxiety down quite a bit. So just a nice little plug for journaling. Anything else for anybody before we go to recap? All right, Gab, take it away.
Thank you. Such a fun topic that we talked about today, self-esteem, and it's such a tricky one. And so I've divided it into 3 categories. We have the camper inception technique, we have create a safe environment, and we also have keeping it real, inspired by Ruby Compton. So within the camper inception technique, we have SAS VIP, and ask your staff members, how do you want to build your camper self-esteem? And create a safe environment, let's use the famous 4 S's. Post-it note, creed your wonderful life, perhaps using the tagline, you're worthy because you exist. And also maybe express some of your vulnerabilities, modeling that is okay not to be perfect. Actually, we know that you're not perfect and we celebrate that. In keeping it real, maybe look at the book Show Up Hard. Talk about your self-esteem is your work to do, and also get your staff members to be curious. I wonder what is going on here. We can also use best engage, validate, empower, women's circles, male call, clumps versus cliques, and also switching that judgment language from judgment to factual language. And that is our recap for today.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Well done.
Oh, good.
This is the point in our podcast where we let you know how you can get involved. You can join us on Twitter with the hashtag Camp Code and let us know the topics you'd like us to discuss, any guests you would recommend that we would like to talk to, or of course, any great leadership training tips that you have to share with us. We would love to hear from you because we are all about sharing in this industry. And if you found our podcast to be useful, we would love it if you could leave us a rating and a review for us in iTunes. And you can do that by going to camphacker.tv/cc_iTunes, or you can tweet your love of the show, which we hope you have, by going to camphacker.tv/campcodelove. And your feedback helps us keep the show going. So this is how you can contact each one of us if you'd like to do so individually. Ruby.
You can email me, ruby@rubyoutdoors.com, or check out my company, rubyoutdoors.com. You can follow me on Instagram @rubyoutdoors and on Twitter @rubylyn85.
Great, thank you. And Gabrielle.
You can check out where I work at ouareau.com, OUAREAU, and you can follow me on Instagram @Gabrielle Rail, and Rail has 2 L's. And also, I just want to recap very quickly. I missed one of the E's for Beth's empathy piece. So that is engage, validate, educate, and empower.
Great, thank you. And you can contact me at beth@gocamp.pro, our website, of course, gocamp.pro, and I'm on Twitter, Topaz Faye. And Ruby is going to tell us what we're talking about next time.
Our next podcast is going to be about best practices for continuing education for your returning staff. Ooh.
We already had a few discussions on it prior to recording, so we're excited about that one. Our final segment on each podcast is a best practice for leadership training. And of course, we would love to hear some of yours so that we can share your effective tips. And you can tell us what they are using the hashtag Camp Code. And for this week, we're going to hear from Ruby.
So this week's best practice is one that I have borrowed from the Beatles Project, beatlesproject.org. Couldn't find a write-up on this, but this is definitely something that's in their system of having a reflective learning community. That's a big thing that they teach when you're implementing their practices at your organization. And so one of the exercises that we did while I did training there, and I love this idea, is that they would essentially kind of put an instructor up, and this instructor has to be willing, or staff member has to be willing, to be vulnerable and take feedback. And so probably needs to have some self-esteem at least to be in this position. But I think this could be a cool routine to establish for your staff meetings or periodically throughout the summer, and could be a problem-solving technique for you going forward. So that instructor stands up and says, here's a challenging situation that I've dealt with as an instructor. And it describes a very specific, not a what if, but like, I dealt with this thing, and sets up what the challenge was, and explains, where they were, what the group dynamic was, a little bit about whatever the student or camper situation was. and then says, okay, what questions do you have? And the questions here are designed for the folks who are listening and the other instructors in the room or counselors in the room to be able to ask questions about like details about the scenario. So they're not saying, did you try this? Have you done this? But they're trying to make sure they really understand the scenario as it is. So you were at this place. How many campers were there total? And what was the mood of the group? What else had you all done that day? So they're just really gathering information. And then everybody who's, a participant in this activity will be split up into small groups, and they talk about what would they have done if they were in that situation. And they're going to brainstorm a list, write it down, et cetera, et cetera. Come back together, have each group share a little bit about what they would have done or what they would propose to do if they found themselves in that same situation. And then the original instructor shares, well, this is what I did, and here's what worked and here's what didn't, and here's what I've learned from all of you all that I would want to do next time. So a really cool way to create that collaborative learning, to also practice giving feedback with a little bit more structure, as far as saying like, not being judgmental about the decisions that they're making, but saying, well, if I was posed with this situation, this is what I would try. You may discover there's more empathy that is built, because you may have people that go, sounds really tough, I don't know what to do. And again, showing your staff that they have a lot of answers and knowledge among themselves. So they don't always have to come to their supervisor. And especially when you have a lot of these kind of frontline challenges or things that people might encounter year after year, that they can work off the knowledge of one another and the experts in the room to get some ideas about how to move forward. So again, shout out to beatlesproject.org for this practice. And again, consider implementing more ways to create that reflective learning environment at your workplace.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Ruby.
Awesome.
Well, that wraps things up for today. Please send your training tips our way. You can pop us an email or reach out on Twitter. And thanks for the listening, friends.